Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Good morning, Shubhodaya. A very warm welcome to yet another session of Weekend with Wisdom. This is Nitin Sridhar. Let me begin with a prayer. Vakratunda Mahakaya Koti Surya Samaprabha Nirvignam Kurume Deva Sarvakaryeshu Sarvada Om Jayanti Mangala Kali Bhadrakali Kapalini Durga Kshama Shiva Dhatri Swaha Swada Namostute Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Hari Om. Very warm welcome to one and all, and we are very happy to welcome back Shri James Boag ji, and thank you for making time, James ji, again for our session. Today, James ji will be speaking on a very interesting topic of Yama, the essential yoga practice. And just a brief introduction. James Boag has been passionately sharing whole life yoga across 3 continents for the last 2 decades, and working with sound and song, movement and meditation, story and inquiry, practical philosophy and study of the classic Samskrita yoga texts. James' programs invite nourishment and vitality to all parts of ourselves as we inquire into the reality of human existence. With his background in languages and literature and having lived in several countries, James brings out the perennial wisdom of Indic tradition to a vivid life in the context of contemporary world. So we are very glad to have you, James ji. Especially your last talk was very enlightening, very enriching. So I also look forward to the today's talk on Yama. Please go ahead and start the session.
Thank you so much, Nitin. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the Indica Weekend with Wisdom series again. And I'm very pleased to be sharing today on the topic of Yama as the essential yoga practice. So the reason why I'm describing Yama as the essential yoga practice will hopefully become clear as we proceed. And this is in the context of the way that the Yama principles are introduced in the Yoga Sutra. So as I'll be working with the Yoga Sutra as our foundation support or our context today, I'll also begin with an invocation. I'll invoke Ganesha, and then I will sing to Patañjali and all the totality or collective of gurus. And then we'll consider what is this essential practice that Patañjali offers us in his beautiful distillation of the practical teachings of yoga in the Yoga Sutra. Gananam tva ganapatigam avamahi Kavim kavinam upamasravastamam jyeshtarajam brahmanam brahmanaspata anashrinvannu tevesira saranam Om gam tat purushaya vidmahi vakratundaya dhimahi tanno randaf prachodayati Om ganganapataye namah Om ganganapataye namah Om Shri Mahaganapataye namaha Om Vande Guruna Sharanarvinde Sandarshita Svatma Sukhava Bodhi Nishre Jangalikayamani Samsara Shantyai Abahu Purushakaram Shankachakra Siddharinam Sahasrashirasam Shvetam Pranamami Patanjalim yogena cittasya parinavacam malam sharirasya cha vairyakena yopakarotam bravaram muninam Patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So, welcome. Thank you for tuning in or for watching. And today the subject is yama, the essential yoga practice. Now, if you are tuning in, watching, listening from India, and you hear the word yama, the first thing that may come to mind might well be the Lord of Death, the god of Dharma, world guardian Yama. But yama also refers to a principle of yoga practice and a collection of principles that we can cultivate that are encoded not just in the Yoga Sutra, but are a very important part of the aṣṭāṅga yoga that are set out in the Yoga Sutra. So when we speak about yama in this context, we will consider the relationship between yama as the god of dharma and the lord of death, and yama as behavioral principles to harness our life force while we have this amazing opportunity of a human birth. Because when we are alive, when we have this amazing opportunity of a human birth, yoga, the practical perspective in the Indic tradition, the practical school, we might say, of Indian philosophy, if you want to use that terminology, yoga seeks to help us live well in the world, in the reality of nature and this realm of constant change, and also remember ourselves, to recognize who we really are. So I began with the invocation to Ganesha. Now, one way we can understand the symbolism of Ganesha, Gana means group. It also means a member of a group. So Gana, group or member. Isha, the Lord, that which can unify the group, which can bring all the different members of the group together. So Ganesha, as that entity in which all the different members are in a remarkable harmony, is an icon, a representation of the coming back into togetherness that yoga teachings and practice are intending to invite us back into. So the idea in yoga, ultimately, we come from oneness, we come from wholeness. And the experience of that wholeness and that completion is our deepest longing. And yoga offers us a practical means to cultivate that oneness right here in the thick of the whirling wonder of natural life, in which we're always experiencing change. So it's really a remarkable perspective. Now, in the Yoga Sutra, I've mentioned briefly what yoga means: to come together, to bring ourselves back into balance, harmony, integration. The Yoga Sutra text, we also have this word sutra. Now, sutra, it means stitch. It also means thread. So the whole Yoga Sutra is a text that is woven with a single thread. Each little stitch, I'm wearing a shirt today, on the hem there are stitches. And each stitch holds, relatively speaking, a vast body of fabric. So it is with the Yoga Sutra teachings. The teachings are ultra condensed, ultra distilled, yet these relatively tiny stitches, these very concise sutras, they hold and offer us a vast body of practical teachings. When we look at the Yoga Sutra, there's this beautiful quality that they have. In the previous session, which you can also watch on YouTube, I referred to the classic definition of a sutra in the Sanskrit tradition. And one of the qualifications or distinguishing attributes of a sutra is its quality of being vishwato mukham. Mukha meaning face or mouth, and vishwataha, all around. So each sutra shines its light out in all directions. It faces all around. So whenever we look into the sutra text, it's going to offer us practical guidance relative to where we find ourselves. And as we look into the text again and again, it can keep offering us fresh perspectives. If we think of our life experience as a journey, every time we look into the text, we're in a slightly different position. And so the text can offer us fresh, practical, helpful insight relative to where we find ourselves. But nonetheless, each sutra is part of this cohesive whole. And this is one thing that's very important. We want to deepen our understanding of the Yoga Sutra text. Everything has been woven with this single thread. And so the yama principles that we're going to speak more about today, these yama principles that I think from the way they're presented in the text we can consider as the essential practice, they come in chapter 2 of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. But in order to understand yama, which are presented in this very condensed form, it's helpful to consider the context that's already been established in the first chapter. Because in chapter 2, which is all about sadhana, the way of practice, this way of practice is being elucidated in chapter 2 to expand and illustrate the core principles that have already been laid out very clearly in the first chapter. So before we get to yama as the essential practice, I think it might be helpful just to kind of situate the yamas when they're introduced in this context of what's already been woven through the first chapter. Speaking of weaving, my first teacher said about the Yoga Sutras, and he heard this from his teacher, the Yoga Sutras are the stitches that weave together the fabric of unity, which I found very, very beautiful. And as I practiced and explored the text over the years since, I came to think of the Yoga Sutras not just as the stitches that weave together the fabric of unity, but also as those stitches that can help us weave greater harmony into the fabric of our lives. So at the beginning of the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali tells us, he's going to tell us about yoga. And then he defines yoga in this very beautiful and inclusive way. And Patanjali tells us that yoga is that state when all of the movements, whirlings, comings and goings of our awareness, we have, as it were, apprehended them, checked them, become aware of them. So they're no longer flitting around and dispersing our awareness, but we've become much more centered. And if we come into that full centeredness, then we can experience the underlying conscious essence that's allowing us to have all the different experiences we ever have. So Patanjali says, Yoga chitta-vritti nirodha. Yoga is the nirodha of the vrittis, of the chitta. Yoga is, I mentioned this in the previous talk. Nirodha can be interpreted in different ways. One way we can understand it is checking. So when we check, when we apprehend, when we become aware of all the different ways that our awareness tends to move here and there, we can come to this centered state of stillness. And in that centered state of stillness, tada drashtuhu svarupe avasthanam, then becomes established in its essential nature our source consciousness, that which allows us to experience, to perceive, to see our conscious essence. But the rest of the time, what's happening? The rest of the time, our awareness is getting identified with all of the different localizations, the things that the awareness gravitates towards, is attracted towards. And so, very naturally, because we are creatures of nature, we've come out of the womb. When we came out of the womb, what was the first thing we did? We took a breath in, and then we took a breath out, most likely with sound. And so you're initiated into the realm of coming and going, of in-breath and out-breath, inspiration and expiration, birth and death, up, down, around and around. We are initiated into the pulsating realm of nature and cyclical change. This is the reality that we are going to experience in. And yoga suggests right here in the thick of all of this whirling wonder, we can actually recognize ourselves. we can actually come home to the experience of the wholeness from which we have come, and which is always our source and our essence. And there's this beautiful thing in the yoga teachings. The path for that doesn't mean leaving the world or trying to ignore reality. Rather, it means wrestling with the beauty of life, with all its comings and goings. So learning, as it were, to dance in the middle of all of this whirling. And this is, of course, illustrated by the icon of Shiva as Nataraja, the Lord of the 5-act dance drama of creation, sustenance, transformation, destruction, the veiling of our essential nature, and the grace and revelation of our essential nature. And the means to remove those veils and come to that recognition is the practice of yoga. Now, the practice of yoga is a vast thing. Yoga is very inclusive and very pragmatic, and it recognizes one person's medicine is another person's poison. One person's nourishment may cause another person to wither away. So yoga offers us a whole ocean of techniques, and yet it also gives us some very robust foundational principles that we can all work with to help our own unique practice to bring ourselves into the joined up integrated state in which we can each recognize and experience our essence. So in the Yoga Sutra, once Patanjali has told us that if we come into that state of yoga, we experience ourselves, and the rest of the time we don't experience who we really are because we get identified with change and limitation and the localizations that we are getting connected to, Patanjali tells us what is yoga practice. And he tells us the effort to foster steadiness. And that effort is dhargakala, long-term, nirantarya, uninterrupted, satkara, attended to with genuine presence, asevita, and a spirit of dedication and devotion, dhrida bhumihi. And then that practice can become well-rooted, well-established. And from those well-established roots, the practice can then grow and evolve. So practice is the effort to foster steadiness. And in very simple terms, that's it. But what does this mean in the context of life? So in the Yoga Sutra, after telling us basically what yoga practice is, Patanjali does a very beautiful thing. He describes how yoga practice works from gross to subtle. When we want to cultivate this experience of being centered, Patanjali and the yoga tradition offer us this basic mechanism, this basic support system, this basic practice method of meditation. And the meditative process harnesses one very significant aspect of our intrinsic human nature. In other words, it works with nature and it works with our dharma. So this word dharma, very important word in the Indic tradition, and it's a word that can be interpreted in lots of different ways in different contexts. But one way I find very helpful to consider dharma, the verbal root dra means to support or sustain, to hold. Dharma as a noun refers to the essential quality of a thing. So for example, one of the dharmas of water is its capacity or its propensity, its tendency to move downwards following the path of least resistance. It also has this cooling quality. Fire, on the other hand, amongst its dharmas are this illuminating and heating qualities. The human dharma has many interesting, significant, distinguishing characteristics. One of them is our self-reflexive awareness. We can notice ourselves, we can observe ourselves, and this is harnessed in meditative practice. Another distinguishing characteristic of the human being is our curiosity. Is it not the case that we are somewhat curious beings? And so the idea in yogic meditation, let's harness these two qualities. Let's harness this spirit of inquiry and this natural curiosity, and let's harness our self-reflexive awareness. And so the yoga tradition suggests if we want to meditate, we can take an object, an ālambana in the language of Patanjali, something around which we can gather the different powers of our awareness. So we turn our awareness towards this object of meditative inquiry, and we just start to look at it. We start to orient towards it, and we harness our curiosity. Now, what happens when we start to look at something carefully, spaciously? Generally, we tend to notice more. And what does that do to our curiosity? It sparks it further and opens the door for a subtle level of inquiry. And so as we're meditating on an object, and we keep coming back to it, our mind may go somewhere else, but we invite it back to the object of meditation, by and by opens up a subtler realm of inquiry. And in that subtler realm of inquiry, if we continue to inquire, we can become absorbed in the inquiry. And so Patanjali lays this out. This is the 17th sutra of chapter 1. Vitarka vicharanandasmita rupanugamat sampragyata. So sampragyata samadhi, the samadhi that is invited and cultivated by using an object of support for our meditation, begins with vitarka. We inquire into that object. We turn the lenses of our attention and inquiry towards the object. Innocently, simply, we come back to the object of focus. And as we're doing that, it's altogether natural and normal that we'll notice our awareness has wandered off somewhere else. No problem. We just, as soon as we notice, we invite our awareness back to the object of inquiry, to the object of focus, to the object of meditation. And by, with practice, sometimes we may find that our awareness starts to get more and more centered. And as that happens, it's like the busy surface level of our awareness settles down. And that allows us to penetrate through to a subtler realm of experience. And then in that subtler realm, we continue to orient towards the object. If we get to the stage where we become absorbed in the object, then we can experience this beautiful thing that is referred to as ānanda. Now, ānanda, one way we can understand it is that state beyond the pairs of opposites. Nanda means child, also means joy. Ananda means without a child, childless, or other than joy, different from joy, less than joy. So Nanda and Ananda are a pair of opposites, but Ananda is that joyfulness that is only ever full. So sometimes people translate it as blissfulness. So you may have experienced, if you're doing something, if you are meditating on something, but even if you are actively working in the world, you're actively involved in a task that you care about, it has purpose, you give yourself to it, and you get absorbed in that task, there's this beautiful thing that can emerge, where as we become absorbed in the present moment, it's almost like we enter eternity. We exit time, because nothing else matters. We're just in this moment, and it is its own completion, its own wholeness. And how does that feel? It feels rather wonderful. And when this emerges in meditation, this wonderful thing happens. Where do we experience this wholeness? Where do we experience this blissfulness? It emerges from within. And so asmita, our sense of I am, our sense of self, starts to shift, because we start to become a little bit less identified with the change and limitation that we experience when we're outwardly engaged with, because everything around us is changing and limited, and the very bodily vehicle through which and with which we experience it is also changing. Instead of being identified with that change and limitation, we start to recognize, oh, this fullness is part of who I really am. And so by and by, through the practice of meditation, we can reconfigure our understanding of who we are. So this is the foundational yoga practice. So if the topic is the essential yoga practice, really the essential yoga technique is meditation. But there's a difference between yoga techniques and yoga practice. I'm currently in Mysore, in South India, a place that has long been associated with yoga in many forms. And in the last century, this has been a place where certain forms of yogasana practice have been practiced, have been taught, have been shared. And sometimes in Mysore, I've been in places where there are many people who've come to study, for example, aṣṭāṅga vinyasa yoga. And I hear people say, or they've even asked me, oh, how was your practice today? How was your practice in the past tense? And I think, no, it's not in the past. I'm still practicing because I'm not yet established in yoga. I'm a practitioner. I'm a student. I have to keep practicing. And what is practice? I already mentioned, it's the long-term, wholehearted, dedicated, uninterrupted effort to foster steadiness. So yoga practice is all the time. It's not just when we're working with the technique, whether it be meditation or asana or pranayama or whatever type of technique we choose to work with. And I would suggest that the fact that in the yoga tradition, we can find many, many different techniques is an invitation to consider, if we want to work skillfully with technique, it might be helpful to work with a range of techniques that support all the different parts of ourselves to come together more easily. But the idea I'd like to emphasize here is that if we're talking about the essential yoga practice, we're not talking about technique. We're talking about principles that can support every moment of our living experience. So in the sutra text, after Patañjali describes yoga practice as this constant, wholehearted, dedicated effort to foster steadiness, after he describes this mechanism of working from gross to subtle, harnessing our spirit of inquiry, using our self-reflexive awareness, inviting ourselves into this experience of wholeness that we relish inside, so we become less susceptible to be pulled this way and that way by the things that are constantly changing around us. Patañjali then offers an alternative means of practice. And he does this in the 23rd sutra of the first chapter, when he says, Ishvara pranidhanad va. So we encounter the particle va. Now this particle va is important in the context of what we're going to talk about today. Va in Sanskrita means and, or, as well, in addition, optional. So this is a very beautiful thing. Patanjali says, Ishvara pranidhanad va, and, or, as well, in addition, optionally. Another way one can come to this experience of yoga, another way one can cultivate yoga, is through the principle of the practice of Ishvara pranidhana, which basically means consecrating everything that we do, offering all our actions to Ishvara, to the source, to God, to the Lord, to that in which all of this exists, and at a more immediate level, to something way beyond our idea of who we are and what all this is. The mystery. Offering our actions to something beyond, to that which enables, underlies, empowers, and holds all of this experience. And Patanjali does this with the particle va. So if you are a person for whom the idea of God or the force of nature or the force of life, whatever you want to call it, resonates, you can harness this as the means to support your practice. But it's very interesting when we think about Ishvara pranidhanad va, and or as well, you can cultivate yoga by making all of your actions offerings to the Supreme Reality. If I want to make my actions an offering, how will I do what I'm doing? Patanjali has already told us yoga practice is that constant, steady effort to foster steadiness. If I'm going to make a constant, steady effort to foster steadiness with genuine presence and a spirit of devotion, what does that mean? It means basically everything that I'm doing, I want to do my best to do it with this wholehearted, genuine presence. And I would suggest if I want to make what I'm doing an offering to that which I consider the highest, to that which I love, how will I do what I'm doing? I'll do it as best I can with wholehearted presence. So Ishvara Pranidhana, whether or not the idea of God resonates for us, the principle is leading us towards the same orientation towards each unfolding moment of this amazing gift of life. Whatever I'm doing, can I do it in such a way that I'm inviting all of myself into the present moment, and I'm making my actions an expression of gratitude for this gift of life? Because this gift of life, it has come to me. Where has it come from? Is a mystery. But even the most rational human being, if he or she is genuinely rational, will have to acknowledge there is so much more that we do not know than we can possibly know. So this gift of life has come to me, and it's an amazing opportunity. Can I give thanks for this gift of life in the way I act? And this attitude of gratitude is a beautiful way to invite greater presence. I'm currently in Mysore, South India, a place where I have spent a lot of time over the years, but it's not that I have a fixed home here. But a long time ago, I said to myself, wherever I am, may I live in Prague. I mean figuratively, not literally. What do I mean? P-R-A-G, which is the way the German spelling of Prague. I would like to live in a place of presence, receptivity, awareness, and gratitude. When I come more present, I become more receptive. When I'm more receptive, my awareness expands. And as my awareness expands, I realize there is so much to be grateful for. And when I feel gratitude, it pulls me more into the present. And so we get this self-supporting positive circle of principles: presence, receptivity, awareness, gratitude. And this is another way of describing the essential yoga practice or the essential yoga technique. Can I invite myself more fully into the present moment so I can free myself from the distracting shackles of anxiety over future outcomes and regret and sorrow over the past, and actually experience the fullness that is here available all the time? In the Yoga Sutra, after Patanjali tells us this alternative method, he then goes on to describe Ishvara in a very beautiful, inclusive way. And then Patanjali talks about how to practice in Sutras 33 to 39. And in Sutra 33, Patanjali gives what we could consider the compulsory practice. And this is going to lead us towards yama, because I'm of the persuasion that when Patanjali lays out the yama principles in chapter 2, he's really expanding on what is already laid out in Sutra 33 of chapter 1. Sutra 33 of chapter 1, Patanjali has also told us by this point, what are the obstacles that we're bound to experience as we cultivate yoga and as we live a human life? He's told us the symptoms that we'll experience when those obstacles are operative. For example, we might notice some disturbance in our breath. We might notice some unsteadiness, things like this. And Patanjali tells us, in order to overcome these obstacles, he mentions vyādi, sthāna, samshaya, pramāda, ālasya, avirati, pranti, darshana, alabdhabhumikatva. And the last one, darshana bhumikatva, excuse me. Vyādi, sthāna, samshaya, pramāda, ālasya, avirati, pranti, darshana, alabdhabhumikatva, anavastitatva. Unsteadiness. So, vyādi, physical indisposition, illness. Sthāna, we're feeling some stupor, some laziness, some lack of get up and go. Samshaya, indecision, doubt. Oh, I want to practice yoga. Let's say, for example, I've been exposed to many different yoga techniques, and I wake up in the morning 1 hour earlier than normal, and I think, wonderful, now I've got an extra hour for my morning yoga practice. But I know 18 different techniques. And then I get into some internal dialogue. Oh, it's the Brahma Muhurta, it's the perfect time to meditate. let me meditate. Oh, but wait a minute. If I start with some asana and pranayama, then maybe my meditation will be more supported and it will be a little bit of a deeper experience. But I feel maybe I'm not used to getting up at this time. Maybe I should do a little bit of chanting to just make sure I'm awake. And before long, what's happened? When we get stuck in doubt and indecision, the present moment goes. So vyadhisthana samshaya pramada basically means carelessness, especially with regards to cultivating the medistate, to cultivating samadhi. Because yoga is very pragmatic. It recognizes the world is constantly inundating us with influences and impressions that would quite likely amplify or accentuate our sense of being identified with change and limitation. So if we want to come out of the bonds of being identified with this change and limitation, we need to really take care to cultivate our practice with regularity. Remember, Patañjali told us, practice is a constant, steady, wholehearted effort to foster steadiness. Alasya is kind of like, sometimes you just don't feel like it. This feeling of can't be bothered. Avirati means not paying adequate attention to the sense and action powers. Our 5 sense powers, our 5 action powers, they are tremendously powerful. Would you agree? For example, have you ever felt that your sense power of sight is pulling you in one direction, and at the same time your sense power of hearing might pull you in another direction? These things, there's the classic image given in the Kathopanishad and also kind of echoed in the Bhagavad Gita of this human vehicle being like this beautiful chariot, but it's pulled by these 10 horses of the indriyaha, the sense and action powers. And our mind, our manas, the interface between the indriyaha and the internal sense of self and the internal lenses of awareness, these are the reins. The pilot is the buddhi, that subtlest aspect of our internal individual consciousness, our intelligence. But the owner of the chariot is the jivatma, the individual soul, our conscious essence. Are we going to move in this chariot in the way that is really in keeping with the deepest longings of our soul? Or are we going to find ourselves pulled hither and thither by the changing impulses and the conditioned preferences of our sense and action powers and our already established limited sense of self? And so the whole play of yoga, the journey, is to, can I bring my chariot and its horses into cohesion? Can I train them to work as a cohesive unit? Now, what is one of the words for reins in Sanskrita is yam. The verb yam means to harness. So yoga, being very pragmatic, it recognizes as human beings, we are, as long as we're alive, we have this gift of prana. We have energy, we have awareness. How are we going to harness it? When the lenses of our awareness flit around and jump around in 100 different directions, they can get used to that. And like everything else in existence, everything in existence, as the Indic rishis saw so clearly, is subject to the play of these 3 gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. So sattva, from the verb as, to be, the essential quality of a thing. Everything that exists, it is, it has its existence, it has its essence. Rajas, it's also, as long as it's in the realm of nature, the realm of birth and death, of expansion, contraction, coming and going, it's subject to constant change. But even though it's subject to constant change, it's also subject to tamoguna, tamas, which is basically, we might say, inertia. Once something has taken on a particular form, it tends to persist in that form. Of course, eventually it will change, but there is this tremendous importance of the first step. First step is half the journey. Once something has taken on a particular form, it wants to keep it. Everything that's alive wants to stay alive, including our habits and our limiting senses of ourself. So our self-identity that is keeping us from the beauty of recognizing our essence, this is a habit that has tamoguna. It has inertia. It is well established. And so if we want to course correct and start moving in a way that is more in keeping with our deeper longing, we have to become adept at managing the reins of this vehicle, at yama, at harnessing our life force. So we'll come to the yama principles in more detail shortly, but coming back to chapter 1 of the Yoga Sutra, I was talking about the obstacles. Vyādhisthāna samshaya pramāda ālasya avirati. Darshanalabdha bhumikatva. So darshanalabdha bhumikatva means when we're practicing yoga, sometimes we come to experience a beautiful state of balance and integration, but then we can't get it back. Anavastitattva, it's not steady. Sometimes we feel balanced, integrated. Sometimes we feel spread thin, dispersed. Sometimes we feel steady, present, confident, courageous. Other times we feel scared and scattered. Completely normal. All of these 9 obstacles, these are just part of the journey. As one of my friends said so beautifully, so pragmatically, obstacles are not on the path. Obstacles are the path, because it's by working through them that we discover, recover, uncover, and bring forth our deeper capacity for yoga. When we feel dispersed, when we feel disintegrated, and we notice, and then we pragmatically work with the resources of our incarnate existence and invite ourselves back into togetherness, then we start to gain deeper confidence in our innate intrinsic capacity to actually bring ourselves into greater cohesion and wholeness. And this capacity for greater cohesion and wholeness is an innate capacity of the human being. Yes, we can experience ourselves feeling dispersed and distracted. We can feel like it's difficult to reconcile different parts of ourselves. But just look at our physical body. It is the living, breathing demonstration and illustration that we do have a miraculous capacity to harmonize, balance, integrate, and reconcile things that are not easy to reconcile. This body is constituted at a certain level of earth, water, fire, air, and space. We exist in a space. We have an earthy, solid quality to us. It's quite hot in Mysore. I'm actually sweating. The blood, sweat, tears of life are adequate testimony to the fact that we are constituted to a large degree of water. And we have an internal combustion engine. We have this fiery quality. Now, normally, earth and water, fire and water, they don't necessarily cohere so easily. For example, if we put earth and water in a glass, like we scoop up at the beach some sandy water, the earthy part's going to subside to the bottom of the glass and the water will stay at the top. But in the physical body, this doesn't happen. It's not like I get up in the morning and when I come onto my feet, all the earthy bit goes down to my feet and I'm this clear watery part on the upper part of my body. That doesn't happen. Similarly, we put fire and water together. If I put too much water on the fire's gone out. And if I boil the water, it boils dry. But here I am, earth, water, fire, air, and space, all cohering in this miraculous way. So as human beings, we do have this extraordinary capacity to bring ourselves into a remarkably integrated and balanced state, to reconcile things that would seem impossible to reconcile. We are already doing it, which suggests we could do it perhaps in an even more refined way. Why not? Let's explore. Patanjali doesn't ask us to believe anything. My teacher said it beautifully. He said, the Yoga Sutra is not the fairy tale of enlightenment. It's the practical manual for enlightenment. Patanjali lays things out, and then it's up to you to go and explore and find out if it works. And I am just a student. I'm just a practitioner. But what I've noticed as I work with the principles that Patanjali lays out, they do help me bring a little bit more cohesion, a little bit more clarity, a little bit more steadiness into my day-to-day life. So after explaining these obstacles, Patanjali then tells us the means to overcome them and to cultivate more of the experience of oneness. And this is Sutras 33 to 39 in chapter 1. And Sutra 33 is very interesting. I'm just going to recite this sutra. It's such a beautiful sutra. Maitri karuna mudito pekshanam sukha dukkha punya punya vishayanam bhavanatas chitta prasadanam. So to bring about the chitta prasadana, the clarification of the lenses and field of our awareness, Patanjali offers us 4 behavioral principles to cultivate and to practice and to enact whenever we meet 4 types of situation. And we see in this sutra, this magnificent sutra, Patanjali's genius for concision, because there's so many different types of situation we could encounter in life. But here he gives us a recipe for an all times, all places type of practice. When I encounter sukham, literally kam means space. So when the space is agreeable, when things are pleasant, maitri is friendliness. Mitra means friend, maitri, friendliness. So when things are agreeable, be friendly. What does that mean? If I want to be friendly with something, I need to give it my attention. I need to be open and present. I don't know about you. Have you ever had the experience where it's like life, the universe, has come along and given you something lovely, something agreeable, something very pleasant, but you've kind of spurned it or turned away from it because, oh no, I need to go and do this. I need to be on with this. I've done this many times. And what this shows me is I'm not really fully established in these basic yoga principles. I need to keep practicing. Because if I was an established yogin, then spontaneously, effortlessly, when I met agreeable situations, I would respond with maitri, with friendliness. I would be open, I would be receptive, I would be warm, I would be friendly. But in life, it's not only sukham that we experience. We don't always experience good, agreeable space. Sometimes we experience dukkha, difficult space, suffering. Patanjali, in such situations, advocates karuna, compassion. Sometimes we encounter in life tremendous virtue, beauty, people doing wonderful things. What does Patanjali advocate? Mudita. When we experience this beauty, this virtue, let it lift us up, let it fill you with encouragement, let it fill you with joy. Now, if we practice maitri, karuna, mudita, when things are agreeable, if we practice being friendly, when there is difficulty and suffering, we practice compassion. When there are wonderful things, we let it fill us with inspiration and joy. This prepares us to then be upeksha, steady, equipoised, equanimous, when we encounter apunya, when we encounter these terrible things, when we encounter horror, terror, injustice, and so on. So, if this sutra is a prescription and a description, it's describing the established yogi, and at the same time, it's giving us a prescription for practice. If I automatically spontaneously, if I'm always friendly when things are agreeable, compassionate when there's suffering, joyful when I see beauty and people doing virtuous things, and nothing can shake me. When I encounter injustice and terror, I'm steady and able to meet it with optimal skillfulness. Then I'm an established yogin. But if not, I know I need to keep practicing. And so then, in sutras 34 to 39, in this ultra distilled way that Patanjali does so beautifully, he lays out a whole ocean of meditative practices that we can take recourse to. And then if we practice those things and we become established in nirbija samadhi, the deepest layers of samadhi, then we're complete. We don't need to carry on. But if we get to the end of chapter 1 and we're not yet established in that ultimate state of yoga, Patanjali's great compassion gives us chapter 2, the sadhana pada, which is about the way of practice. And this chapter begins, Patanjali does a beautiful thing. He gives us what I call the 3-in-1 method of active yoga practice in the world. When we're going to be working with yoga techniques, and we're also going to be doing our best to cultivate yoga all day long. And the opening sutra of chapter 2, tapasvadhyayeshvara pranidhanani, tapasvadhyayeshvara pranidhanani kriya yogaha. So kriya yogaha, the active cultivation of yoga through practice, has 3 constituent parts: tapaha, svadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana. But this sutra is so beautiful because we find tapasvadhyayeshvara pranidhanani, in the plural. These three constituents, we have the plural ending ani. Kriya yoga is in the singular. So what this tells us very explicitly through the way it's presented linguistically is that yoga practice is not, it's not like I just choose one precinct of practice and I confine myself to that. No, all these different aspects of practice are mutually complementary. I have to have the tapaha, I have to have the svadhyaya, and I have to have the ishvara pranidhana. What are those things? Very briefly, any of them could be the topic of a very expanded talk, but tapaha literally means a heat. When we start practicing yoga, we're basically saying, I've recognized I'm not in yoga, and I'd like to do something about it. I've recognized that I don't know myself that well. Sometimes I find myself doing things that are not really in keeping with my deeper longings. I'm not always behaving in a way that I'd like to. Once I own and acknowledge that, I can start to cultivate practice. Practice means making an effort to foster that change, to become more steady and more clear. From chapter 1, what do we know about yoga practice? It's all about cultivating steadiness and clarity of awareness. So tapaha means the heat that comes from the yatna, the effort of practice to bring about this transformation. When I make an effort, it's going to create some friction. That heat is going to allow change to happen. So when we're working with yoga practices, with yoga techniques, we want to make sure that when we're applying that effort and we're creating that friction, we're creating that fire of transformation, it's a nourishing, warming fire. It's not the type of fire that's going to burn the house down or destroy the vehicle. Let it be yogic tapas. Yoga always happens in the middle. It's not extreme fire that would ravage and destroy. It's the fire that nourishes, that welcomes, that propels. Svadhyaya, this effort, this heat of yogic discipline, of balanced, nourishing discipline, has to be accompanied or is accompanied by svadhyaya. Sva, the self, jha, to meditate, are upon. So basically, it's this spirit of inquiry, the spirit of studentship, always inquiring, always paying attention. How is the technique serving me? Is it nourishing me? Is it burning me dry? Is it making me more vital? Is it clarifying the lens of my awareness? Is it making me more steady? And then thirdly, ishvara pranidhana, consecrating my efforts, offering my practice to something beyond, to that which represents the totality, to that which is beyond all my limited ideas, to that which is my deepest core, my deepest essence, to the mystery which holds all of this. So I'm making an effort, but I'm doing it in a spirit of inquiry and studentship, and I'm offering that effort to the highest that I can, to that which is even beyond my imagination, to God, to the ultimate reality. And if I don't resonate with the idea of God, I'm offering it to the source. I'm offering it to the mystery of consciousness. So this is the basic framework to keep in mind when we're practicing yoga techniques and we're making the effort to cultivate yoga in day-to-day life. Now, later in chapter 2, Patañjali then elaborates the active way of practice when he introduces the aṣṭāṅga, the 8 limbs. Now, the 8 limbs, yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, jhana, samadhaya, aṣṭāṅgāni. These are the 8 limbs. They are 8 angas. Now, anga means a member. Sometimes it gets translated as a limb. Now, if we think of the members or the limbs of our body, how did they grow? When we came out of the womb, was it that, okay, right arm becomes adult arm, and then once that's fully developed, then the left arm? No. All the limbs, all the members grow together. So it is definitely the case that the 8 limbs, in some contexts, in some situations, one begets the next. they do go from gross to subtle, but nonetheless, they are all present in any yoga practice and any yoga technique. And this group of 8, yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi, these 8, they all complement each other. Nonetheless, this group of 8, the first member, yama, and the last member, samadhi, are of special importance. So samadhi is synonymous with yoga. This is what all the other angas are aiming to cultivate. They're aiming to invite and allow the experience of samadhi, that we can rest in the recognition of who we really are and move through life from that very centered state. The first member, yama, we've already mentioned yama. It means death, or it means the Lord of Death, the Lord of Dharma. But yama also means the reins. It means to harness. Now, sometimes people talk about yama as restraint. Sometimes practicing yamas will involve self-restraint. But I find it more helpful to think about yama as behavioral principles to harness our life force for the sake of samadhi, for the sake of yoga. Because the idea of restraint has the sense of don't, and Patanjali does not deal in don'ts. Patanjali was a Maharishi. He understood human nature, and so he understood very well. If we hear, for example, think now, human being, of anything you like, but on no account must you think of a turquoise blue elephant with a pink trunk. Now, who is the human being who can hear that instruction, think of anything you like, except a turquoise-colored elephant with a pink trunk? When I hear that instruction, what do I see in my mind? I see the turquoise-colored elephant with the pink trunk, which tells us, which illustrates something that modern psychologists have apparently discovered recently, but which the great masters knew millennia ago. The human being doesn't do so well with negative instruction. Patanjali was a master of the human experience. So is Krishna in the Gita. And the way that the yoga teachings are conveyed in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Yoga Sutra, throughout the tradition, is as an invitation. It's an empowerment. So Patanjali doesn't deal in don'ts. He gives us active principles to cultivate. And we can see this very clearly when we turn to the language of how the yama principles are introduced. So Patanjali tells us the 8 limbs. And then he tells us, tatra, there amongst them, ahimsa, satya, aṣṭāṅga, brahmacharya, parigraha, yama. So in the 8 limbs, the yamas, there are 5 yama principles. Ahimsa, satya, aṣṭāṅga, brahmacharya, and aparigraha. And then in the 31st sutra of chapter 2, Patanjali does something utterly extraordinary. It's a little bit like Sutra 33 in chapter 1. In Sutra 33, in chapter 1, we had Maitri Karuna Mudita Upekshanam Sukadukha Punya Punya Vishayanam Bhavana Tishchita Prasadanam. There is no va, no optionality in Sutra 33. But in Sutras 34 to 39, for example, Prachardana Vidharanabhyam Va Pranasya, Vishyavati Va Pratiruppanna Manasastiti Mandani, Vishoka Va Jyotishmati, Vitaraga Vishyam Va Chittam, Swapnidra Jnana Lambanam Va. All those subsequent sutras, they all have the particle Va. They're all optional. But Sutra 33, those 4 ways to behave, of being friendly when things are agreeable, being compassionate when things are difficult, being joyful when we see beauty and virtue, and being steady and equanimous when we see terrible things. No va. And what that tells us, that is the compulsory practice. That is the essential practice. Now, in Sutra 31, in the 2nd chapter, what do we see? Patanjali does something that he doesn't do anywhere else in the text. So he gives us the 8 limbs. He tells us amongst the 8 limbs, we have these 5 principles of ahimsa, satya, aṣṭāṅga, brahmacharya, and aparigraha. And then Sutra 31. Jati desha kala samayana vachinna sarva bhauma mahavratam. So then Patanjali tells us these yama principles, they are the mahavrata. Now vrata, I'm sure many of you know this, but vrata means the vow. And maha, the great vow. So mahavrata, the great vow. Now, a sutrakara, one who writes sutras, is always aiming for concision. And they say in the tradition, if you're a sutrakara and you can trim your work by just even one syllable, then you can throw a party like you've just had a grandchild in your family line, because concision is so prized. So what this means is that whenever we encounter in the Yoga Sutra any place where it seems that Patanjali is using more syllables than would be strictly necessary, it is not accidental. There is tremendous import of those seemingly superfluous or potentially seemingly superfluous syllables. And this is what we find in Sutra 31. If Patanjali told us the 5 yamas are hinsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, parigraha, and they are mahavrata, with just those 4 syllables, we would already understand, okay, these yamas, they're super important. Mahavrata, great vow. This is a big deal. I'm going to pay extra attention now. We'd already understand they're super important. But Patanjali doesn't stop there. He says, sarva bhauma mahavratam. Sarva bhauma, on all grounds, in all situations, at all times, in all places. These are the great vow. Okay, they're not just super important, they're super duper important. Okay, 8 syllables. Sarva bhauma mahavrata. We already understand that they are super important. But Patanjali doesn't stop there. He says, jati desha kala samayana vachinna sarva bhauma mahavrata. He uses 21, well, 4 syllables, mahavrata. He uses an additional 17 syllables to emphasize the primacy of yama. Jati desha kala samayana vachinna sarva bhauma mahavratam. These are the great vow, on all grounds, at all times, in all places. Jati desha kala. Doesn't matter the circumstance of your birth, the situation you find yourself in, the place you're in, the zeitgeist, the tendencies or habits or customs of the time. None of that makes a difference. These yamas, they are the great vow. And what is a vow? A vow is something you do. So in Sutra 30, something you adhere to, something you honor. They're a positive principle. So yes, restraint, in order to do these practices, to work with these yama principles, in many situations, that will involve self-restraint. But the yamas are more than restraint. These are things we can actively cultivate. And that's what Patanjali is telling us to do in Sutra 31. These things you have to actively practice, actively cultivate all the time. What are these essential principles? What is the essential yoga practice? What are the principles that can help us harness our energy in such a way that it can bring us into that more centered state? First, ahimsa. Then we have satya, and we have asteya, brahmacharya, and aparigraha. So ahimsa comes first, and it is said, if you can become established in ahimsa, then you can become established in all of the yamas. And if you can become established in ahimsa, basically you can become established in yoga. So the whole job can be done right there. All of the yamas are intending to support the experience and the embodiment of ahimsa. So what is ahimsa? Hinsa means harming. Ahimsa, we have the prefix which stands for na. And na, as you may imagine, means not, or no, or none. However, something super significant. When we add the prefix to the previous word, in this case, hinsa, ahimsa is not a negative thing. So often we find English translations of ahimsa as non-harming or non-violence or non-violation. These are all very good partial translations. They're not inaccurate. But ahimsa is not something we don't. It's something we do. It's a principle that we actively cultivate. It's the great vow to be done, to be practiced, to be incarnated, to be shared, to be embodied, all times, all places, no matter what's going on. So it's more than a restraint. To practice may involve restraint, but it's something that we're actively cultivating. So the way I think of ahimsa is cultivating harmony. Yes, definitely, do our best to avoid harming. But can I actually cultivate harmony? Can I practice loving kindness? This is ahimsa. Satya, from the verb as, giving us words like sat. Satya means truthfulness. So yes, it means do not tell lies, but that's just one small part of what satya means. Satya, from the verb as, also means presence. It means authenticity. Yes, it means to be honestly, properly, appropriately all of who you are, as is demonstrated so beautifully in the mythology, in the Purana, for example, by Krishna, by Shiva, who are always unapologetically, disinhibitedly their full selves. So satya, yes, truthfulness, yes, honesty, but it also has this quality of presence and authenticity. Aṣṭāṅga. Steya means theft, stealing. Aṣṭāṅga, non-stealing. Yes, good translation, but not a total translation. Because again, aṣṭāṅga is not a knot. It's something to actively cultivate. So we could think of aṣṭāṅga as well as meaning not stealing. I would suggest cultivating respectfulness. If we're genuinely respectful, we're not going to be stealing people's time or resources or energy. We're going to be interacting with them in a respectful way. Similarly, with regards to our resources and regards to our own resources. Now, that's an important thing to mention about these yama principles. They're not just about how we relate to others and the world around us. They're also about how we relate to ourselves. Remember, Patañjali has told us, all times, all places, all situations, in all our relations, in all our interactions, can we cultivate these beautiful 5 yama principles? So ahimsa, cultivating harmony, satya, presence, truthfulness, honesty, appropriateness, aṣṭāṅga, respectfulness. 4th, we have brahmacharya. Now, brahmacharya is one of those Sanskrit words, and there are so many of them that can have very different meanings and very strong connotations, and even a shift in its denotative sense dependent on the context. What does it mean literally? Char means to behave. Brahma, Brahman, totality. Brahmacharya means, well, behaving in such a way that it invites us into the experience of oneness and wholeness. One gentleman came to a class I gave in Mysore many years ago, and he said one way he liked to think of brahmacharya was walking the path of godliness, which I thought was a beautiful translation. But when we come to printed translations of the Yoga Sutra, sometimes we might find brahmacharya described as celibacy or continence. And this is not the whole story, because brahmacharya in this context is a yama. It's something we always do. And Patañjali is obviously a great humanitarian. He is not against the continuation of the human species. So why do people sometimes say brahmacharya means celibacy? Because brahmacharya in another context refers to the first stage of the classic 4 stages of life in the Indian tradition. When one is young, when one is left infancy, one becomes a child from around 7 or 8 through to the early 20s, one enters the stage of life, the ashrama, that's known as brahmacharya. And one's duty, one's job during that stage of life is to be a student, is to learn, to chara, to behave, to walk, to move, to operate, to function in a way that is conducive to Brahma, to cohesion. The idea being, during that first stage of life, your responsibility is to learn, and to learn in ways that can then help you as you go into the second stage of life, grihastra, the householder, function in society in such a way that you behave such that your actions support the cohesion of the whole. They support loka sangraha, they support dharma, and they support a flourishing society. Once you've had children and they've had children, then you move to vanaprastha. You move out of the tumult of the city and worldly life. You still have an advisory role. You're still involved in society, but you're starting to move towards retirement. You're becoming less involved in the comings and goings of life, and you're preparing for the ultimate stage, sannyasa, where you leave all worldly things behind. Why? Because you've already drunk deep from the cup of life. You already lived it to the hilt. And this is the idea. In the ideal situation, you learn really well during the brahmacharya stage. You experience the pleasures, the joys, the ups and downs of life in a skillful way during the grihastha stage. During the vanaprastha, you can give wise counsel to the people who have now taken the reins and are driving society forwards. And then as you've seen your children, your grandchildren move into maturity, you feel that sense of contentment, that wholeness. You've lived life well, and then you can renounce easily. So in that context, brahmacharya has the very strong connotation of celibacy, because there is the idea when one is a brahmachari, a young student, one is not involved in sexual relations. Imagine, there you are, 15 years old, and you're just aflame for knowledge. You've got great teachers. This is, many of us have experienced school in a very potentially limiting way. But imagine a situation in which you're in a learning context where you've got wonderful teachers, wonderful role models. You're learning in a very holistic, pragmatic way. You're developing skills, you're developing your competencies and your capacities. And it's thrilling to become more and more empowered as you're learning from great teachers. And every day, every week, you're learning new skills. You're taking on more responsibility. And you're aflame for knowledge. You're aflame for God. And you're deep in your studies. And then she or he comes along and you become infatuated. And then if you enter into that realm of intimacy, what happens to the ardor of your intent towards your study? It gets dissipated. So it's the idea that during the brahmacharya stage, one is sheltered not just from sexual intimacy, but from all sorts of worldly responsibilities, because your responsibility is to study. And if you study well, you create this very strong structure and foundation that when you then go into the pleasures of the world, you can do so from a well-prepared foundation. So in that context of the ashramas of life, brahmacharya does mean celibacy. But here in the Yoga Sutra, that's not necessarily the case, because the Yoga Sutra is for anybody who's interested, including people who have families. Patanjali is not against the continuation of the human species. But let's be pragmatic. And within the yoga tradition, we find so many practices for married, committed couples to harness, again, yama, to harness the sexual energy in a way that is conducive to deepening harmony and deepening insight. So one way we can think of brahmacharya pragmatically, continence, certainly. Let us contain our energy. Let's not waste it. And let's be tremendously respectful of our sexual energy, and certainly not use it in an inappropriate or irresponsible way. But we're not going to be doing that anyway if we're practicing ahimsa, satya, and asteya. So sexual propriety, sexual responsibility, definitely, that's already covered in ahimsa, satya, and asteya. Brahmacharya really means, from my understanding, what it really means is take tremendous care of this gift of life force and energy. Use it to chara, to move, to behave in ways that take you towards the experience of Brahman, towards the experience of totality. If you are involved in a long-term married, committed life type of thing, then all aspects of that relationship become tremendously potent means to walk a path together. There is the idea of yugala sadhana that the married couple undertake together. They're playing on the same team. But if you are not a person who's involved in the family realm, then that means you need to use that energy in a slightly different way. You're going to be walking a singular path. But nonetheless, whoever you are, whether you're in the family realm, whether you're in the realm of the renunciates, all the different aspects of your energy, including, of course, the very potent sexual energy, need to be respected, treated with care, and channeled, yamad, towards yoga. Now, if you are a householder, channeling that energy. If, say, for example, you're a married man and you go to some yoga class and you hear that the yamas are the most important practice, and you find a translation, I would say a slightly misleading translation, that says you need to be celibate when you're a family man, you go home to your wife and say, oh, and she was really happy you were doing this yoga because you were getting more calm, you were being a little bit more responsive and less reactive. She's like, oh yeah, I'm really liking you going to the yoga class. And then you come back and say, oh dear, yeah, I learned a new yoga practice today. It means I'm going to be celibate. It's not going to be very good for conjugal harmony, most likely. The most orthodox teacher I have worked with made it very clear. Says if you're a family person, then the whole realm of intimacy also needs to be harnessed for the sake of yoga. So yama is harnessing all our actions for the sake of deepening harmony. That is ahimsa. And then the last of the yamas, aparigraha. So gra means to grab. So question, would you like to drink deep from the cup of life? I hope the answer is yes. If I want to drink deep from the cup of life, I've got to grab the cup. Would you agree? But let me grab it, not too hard. This is aparigraha. I would suggest that. So aparigraha, you can get it translated as non-covetousness, non-grasping. Just like non-stealing for asteya or non-harming for ahimsa, non-covetousness, non-grasping for aparigraha is a very good beginning translation, partial translation of aparigraha. But I think of aparigraha more holistically as loosening my grip, staying present, still holding the cup of life as best I possibly can, but without excess tension. If I grip it too tightly, I'm going to waste energy. I'm not going to be able to enjoy the drink. But if I don't grip it, the cup's going to fall from my hand. So aparigraha, to me, one way we can understand it, it's just describing that sweet spot, that balance, that fine edge, that fine line of being present, but free from expectation, of giving myself to my actions, free from expectation. And so we see in the Yama principles a distillation of all of these principles that the yoga teachings are urging us towards. Presence in a balanced, sustainable, nourishing way. Because if our practice is not nourishing, it won't sustain. The only practice techniques that will really stay with us are ones that bring us that deep nourishment. We have to love our practice. And I would suggest that really what yama is all about is not so much restraint, but is harnessing our true capacity. And that will involve restraint, of course, but it's actually about setting free our greater potential, bringing forth the beauty and the love that we are each capable of. We all are these aspects of this infinite creative capacity of consciousness. We all have a tremendous capacity for beauty. Yama, these principles can help us live life with more beauty, with more grace, with more presence. So cultivating harmony, presence and authenticity, being respectful, taking a special care with our energy and checking, am I behaving in ways that move towards more of an experience of wholeness? And when I am being present, can I maintain that sense of balance? I'm not grasping. This is what we find throughout the Yoga Sutra and other texts, like Sthira Sukhamasana describing asana. It's steady, but it's easy as well. So I'm engaged, and yet I'm also relaxed. This is also there in aparigraha. So I mentioned asana, the third of the 8 limbs. Sthira Sukhamasana is Patanjali's definition. If I want to practice asana in a Sthira Sukha way, a way that is steady and easeful, what better way than to work with the yama principles? And this is the idea. The yamas, if I'm doing asana or pranayama or pratyahara, if I'm doing asana, pranayama, if I'm doing meditation, if I'm working with those techniques, then let me do those techniques, cultivating those 5 yama principles. And then when I'm doing yoga, I'm actually making the effort to become more of a yogi, one who's actually established in these principles. When I'm fully established in those principles, then spontaneously I'll behave in the ways that have been laid out in Sutra 133. I'll be friendly when things are agreeable. I'll be compassionate when things are difficult. I'll be joyful when I see beauty, and I'll be steady, come what may. If I'm not spontaneously, automatically reacting like that, then let me work with these yama principles. Another beautiful thing about the yama principles, when we find ourselves in those situations in life where we feel a bit unsure, where we feel torn, is this the voice of my conscience, or is this my tricky mind ego complex masquerading as my conscience? When we find ourselves on the battlefield of the Bhagavad Gita, part of us feels like, I have to do this. Part of us feels like I can't do this. I look this way. I don't want to do that. I look that way. I don't want to do that. When I feel torn, when I come to these junctures in life, as I will many times, the yama-s, we can take them as 5 spokes of a wheel. If we add the niyama principles, 10 spokes of a wheel, we can work with the niyama principles as well. They're also very, very pragmatic, very, very helpful. But just today, our focus has been yama. We take these 5 principles and we ask ourselves, what would really be cultivating harmony here? And if the answer seems to be something that we don't feel at ease with, then we say, well, what does Satya say? What is truthful here? What's the truth here really? What's the authentic action? How can I be respectful of all the different parties involved here? How can I do this in a way that's actually moving towards greater cohesion, greater wholeness, Brahman? And how are my own expectations and preferences affecting the way I'm seeing this, aparigraha? So the yama principles, ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, parigraha, cultivating harmony, presence, respectfulness, taking care with how we channel our energy, loosening our grip, they can help us all times, all places. Patanjali tells us these are the all times, all place practice, all times, all place technique. But what did he tell us in chapter 1? Yoga practice is all the time. So whatever technique we are working with, let's work with the yama principles. So that's the idea of yama as the essential practice. There's so many amazing techniques in yoga. But yoga practice isn't when we're working with technique only. Yoga practice is all the time. And the yama principles, as I understand them, they're a tremendously robust and time-proven structure or frame to help us cultivate yoga all the time. Mentioning time, I think it might be that stage of today's session where we go over to Q&A.
Yes, indeed. You can just share concluding remarks before we go to Q&A.
Okay, so this is a big topic, a vast topic, and I hope that what I've shared today kindles your enthusiasm to explore applying these yama principles in all aspects of life, but especially if you already work with a yoga technique. If, for example, you like to meditate, you like to do asana, you like to do pranayama, how can I do this technique in a way that cultivates deeper harmony, deeper balance? How can I do it in a way that's authentic and proper to me? How can I make this practice my own so it's serving all parts of myself, including those parts of myself that I habitually neglect or leave out? How can I respect all parts of myself when I do this practice? How can I do this practice in a respectful way, not being greedy? How can I do this in a way that it's really being respectful of my energy? And how can I do it beyond expectations? These are tremendously potent lenses for inquiry. We mentioned the yoga works with our human nature. One key quality of our human nature is this curiosity. So yoga always is an inquiry. So the yamas are this beautiful frame for ongoing inquiry and hopefully a practice that can be very nourishing and ultimately more and more liberating.
Thank you very much, James G, for a very wonderful and as the last time, very enriching session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have received a very wonderful responses. Dr. Vayan Rao says that it was a very excellent session and very highly enlightening approach to yoga practice. And we have another attendee who calls the session outstanding. So one question we have received is, how can we learn yoga this way? I think in the way you mentioned how to learn is the question.
So one thing that I find so resonant about the yama principles is, I think in the previous talk I mentioned this idea of, in the Upanishads we have our essence described as sat and chit and ananda. So sat, it's being, it exists. Chit, it's conscious, and ananda, it's beyond the pairs of opposites, it's blissful. So one way we can begin to explore how can I practice with these yamas is, when I do my yoga techniques and I do my best to do them in accord with the yama principles, I notice more sat, more chit, more ananda. So what do I mean? More sat, I notice I'm a little bit more present. What does that mean? Well, chit is obviously a mystery, the vast reach of consciousness. But do I notice myself doing things that I would not want to do a little bit quicker than I used to? And when I've come off center, when I've come off balance, I catch myself a little bit more quickly. And not only do I catch myself a little bit more quickly, but I react to my own foibles and my own stumblings with more ahimsa, with more kindness. So one thing I've experimented with, and I've shared this with people I've practiced and studied with and given classes to over, well, quite a long time now. A very lovely way to explore yama is to take the 5 principles and make them the focus of our day for a week. So, okay, this week I'm going to commit to ahimsa. So at the beginning of the day, when I do my meditation or when I start doing my practices, even before, okay, today, the subject is ahimsa. How can I cultivate harmony? And then all the things I do during the day, I can just check in. I can let this be my focus. This is especially helpful to do with a group. So if you have a practice partner or you're part of a satsang, you can do it alone for sure. But if you're doing it with other people, the collective energy also helps. And then you can also compare notes, maybe at the end of the week or a couple of times during the week. You can check in with your practice partner. You know, what is the focus on ahimsa doing for you? What are you noticing? So the person who taught me this practice, it was a very interesting situation. I was invited to teach in the US some years ago, and I was invited to speak. The lady teacher, she was giving a Yoga Sutra class, and she invited me to be a guest. And I spoke a little about chapter 1. And she realized that she had misunderstood one of the sutras, like she hadn't studied Sanskrit. She was working from translation. And she thought, oh no, I've got that sutra all wrong. And she said, oh, it makes me think maybe I should stop teaching the Yoga Sutra. And I said, no. So this lady, her situation was quite extraordinary. She had come to yoga because she'd been a drug addict on the streets of Seattle, and she was a heroin and crack cocaine addict. And it just so happened that at the University of Washington, there in Seattle, they were conducting research on the use of yoga and cognitive behavioral therapy as an intervention to help people come out of addiction. And she was invited to join this research program, and she said yes. She'd seen other people she was using with on the street die. So she took this opportunity. And in not much time at all, she had a new addiction. Because she loved the yoga, she went to the yoga class, she felt amazing. She went to all the sessions, she did the homework. The homework was you learned something in the yoga class, you went home and practiced it. And she had some determination, and she started doing the practices, and she felt so good. And she felt so grateful. This yoga saved my life. So she goes to the bookshop, and this bookshop in Seattle, I've actually been to the same bookshop since. It has quite a big Eastern philosophy section. She goes there, she looks for a book about yoga. She sees all these words she's never seen before. Bhagavad Gita, Veda, Upanishad. She's never seen or heard these words. Yoga Sutra, this must be about yoga. She pulls this copy of the Yoga Sutra off the shelf. She buys it, she goes home, she opens chapter 1. And it doesn't make much sense to her. It doesn't seem to have much to do with what she's been learning in the classes. But then she opens to the yama section. And the translation she had, I think it was the translation of Bernard Blanchard, a French translation. And he does a lovely job because he, in the work that he has, I think it's called, in French, is Miroir de Soi. I don't know what it's called in the English translation, but it is available. He does a lovely job of not translating the verses. He does offer translation, but also showing how the verses are invitations to inquiry. And so every sutra, he gives lots of different questions you can use for inquiry. I think it was that version that this person had. And when she comes to the yama section, the author has laid out these questions. Have you ever done anything to harm yourself? And when she opens the book at this page, she feels like she's been struck by a light, and she says, oh yes, Satya, have you ever lied to yourself? Or aṣṭāṅga, have you ever stolen your own time, your own? And she's like, well, this, I don't know what, I couldn't understand chapter 1, but this makes sense to me. So I'm going to practice this, because she was fighting for her life. And so she started this practice. That's how she began. This week, I'm going to make ahimsa my focus. Next week, satya, next week, aṣṭāṅga, next week, brahmacharya, next week, aparigraha. And then she did the same for the niyamas. And what she found, and she told me this, is that as she practiced, for example, the 3rd week on aṣṭāṅga, respectfulness, non-stealing, she noticed, I can't do this unless I'm also practicing satya and ahimsa, unless I'm also practicing brahmacharya and aparigraha. So she found that the 5 yama principles, they all support each other. And as she worked with them, they helped her bring more and more presence into her day-to-day life and become freer and freer of the old habits that had been so damaging for her. And so I said to her, no. Seriously, I think you understand the Yoga Sutra in some ways more deeply than many of the Sanskrit pundits I've studied with who don't practice them. They understand the language, but you understand the principle because you've been practicing it. And this text is not to be studied from the outside. Yoga, to study in yoga means to practice. To practice means to study. They go together. This is jnana and vijnana, the 2 wings of the bird of practice. Just to study, you don't study about yoga, you study yoga. That's a huge difference. In chapter 1 of Yoga Sutra, Patañjali tells us the pramanas, pratyaksha, anumana, agama. First pratyaksha, direct experience, then inference, and then agama, then the teachings that come. In modern education system, it's all agama. You get information. That's not the yogic way. The yogic way is always experiential. So how to start? I would suggest start with ahimsa. Okay, how can I be kinder to myself, the people around me, and my environment? How can I cultivate harmony and loving kindness today? And explore that. And then explore, how can I be more authentic? How can I be more present? How can I be more truthful? And if you do that in 5-week cycles for a year, I think you'll have an amazing experience. And it's a really tremendously potent frame for ongoing yoga practice. And if you are an asana practitioner or a pranayama practitioner, or you do, like I like to recite hymns, for example, whenever you're working with a technique, especially then, use that time to cultivate the yama principles and then see what happens. That's what I would suggest in response to that, Nitin.
Thank you very much, James. I think we are already beyond the time. Just one final question. Somebody is asking how they could join your, how they can practice yoga with your group. Do you have a group practice where they can join?
Yes. So I do travel and teach, but I also teach online. So the best way to hear about anything I'm doing is to go to my website, jamesboagyoga.com. And at the foot of most pages, certainly on the home page, you can sign up for the newsletter. And I'm currently doing this year a Bhagavad Gita course, which is a 60-hour course. We're doing chapter 2, and we'll do one other chapter. But I'm also about to start in February. It's for a training program in Switzerland, a 21-hour course on Yoga Sutra. So if you found today's content interesting, you'd like to look more into Yoga Sutra, it's not my own course. I'm a guest teacher at a yoga studio. So in my own courses, I tend to we'll also learn to recite the text. and they'll maybe have a bit more time. But this is a 21-hour course, so we'll get a nice solid overview of chapter 1 and chapter 2, and you could join that course. Everybody will have access to the recordings. It'll be 14 90-minute sessions from late February through to the first days of June. So I can I'll send the link to Nitin, and we can maybe put that in the show notes.
Yes, you please share the link with me. Anybody interested can write to us, and we'll share the link with them.
Yeah, and my website, if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll always hear about any of the online and in-person programs.
Thank you very much, James, for a really enriching session, and we look forward to more such sessions from you in the future, and perhaps we can take up niyama and other aspects also in more detail. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Nitin, and thank you everybody for joining.
Viewers, do follow us on Facebook and Twitter for updates about our upcoming program. We will conclude with a prayer. Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha, Gurur Sakshat Parabrahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha, Hari Om.